When European ships set sail in the 15th century, they carried more than explorers. They carried ambition, power, and plans to reshape the world. What followed would leave permanent marks on nearly every continent, politically, economically, culturally, and geographically. This is the story of how European colonization changed the world. We're going to take a journey, you and I, a journey through time, to understand how the events of centuries ago still echo in the world we live in today. How did we get here? Why are borders drawn where they are? Why do some countries struggle while others prosper? These are complex questions, and the answers, as you might imagine, are complex too, but they're questions worth asking, because understanding the past is the key to unlocking a better future. So, let's dive in. Let's begin with politics. Colonization wasn't just about discovery, it was about control. Imagine, if you will, lands you've never seen, cultures you don't understand, suddenly becoming yours for the taking. That was the mindset. European powers like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, they carved up the world like a cake. They divided lands they had never seen into colonies, often ignoring the people who already lived there. They redrew boundaries, claimed ownership, and said, "This is how it shall be." They installed European systems of government, systems that were familiar to them, but completely foreign to the people they now ruled. In many cases, indigenous political systems, rich in history and tradition, were simply wiped out. In Africa, kingdoms with centuries-old leadership traditions were weakened, sometimes destroyed. Think of the Ashanti Empire, the Benin Empire, the Congo Kingdom, once powerful, now shadows of their former selves. In the Americas, the Aztec and Inca empires, civilizations of incredible complexity and beauty, were dismantled by Spanish conquistadors, their emperors imprisoned or killed, their people enslaved. In their place, colonial administrations were established. But these new governments, they weren't designed to serve the people who lived there. They were designed to benefit the home country. Local rulers were often removed, imprisoned, or co-opted, their voices silenced. European monarchs, sitting on thrones thousands of miles away, appointed viceroys and governors who reported directly back to them. This created centralized, hierarchical power structures where decision-making happened oceans away. Can you imagine that? Having no say in how your own land was run, your own destiny decided by someone who'd never even met you? And here's the thing. Even after independence movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, many of these political systems remained. The legacy of colonial borders and government structures continues to influence politics today, especially in Africa and Latin America. The ghosts of colonization still linger in the halls of power. Now, let's talk economics, because colonization wasn't just a power grab. It was a business venture. These colonies, these lands full of people, they became sources of wealth. And their resources, their gold, their silver, their diamonds, their spices, their very people, they were exploited on a massive scale. In the Americas, minerals like silver and gold, riches beyond imagination, were mined using forced labor. Entire populations of indigenous people were enslaved under systems like the encomienda, where Spaniards were granted the right to demand labor and tribute. They called it a system, but it was really just another word for exploitation. And as the indigenous workforce died from disease and brutal conditions, European powers turned their greedy eyes to Africa, and so began the darkest chapter in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Over 12 million Africans, men, women, children, were forcibly taken from their homelands, their families ripped apart, their cultures shattered. They were sold into slavery, treated like animals, to fuel plantation economies in the Americas. Imagine the unimaginable. A human being, bought and sold like property. And what did the colonies get in return for their stolen resources, their exploited labor? They became markets for European goods. Europeans exported textiles, guns, and tools, then imported sugar, tobacco, cotton, and spices, all produced by the sweat and blood of those they had colonized. It was a system designed to enrich Europe, not the colonies. It was a one-sided deal, a rigged game where the colonies could never win. Colonial economies were built on inequality, and many post-colonial nations are still grappling with the long-term consequences of that economic dependence and underdevelopment. The scars of this economic exploitation run deep, my friends, deep. Culturally, colonization was a tidal wave, washing over ancient traditions, languages, and beliefs. You see, European colonizers often believed their cultures were superior. They saw themselves as bringing civilization, enlightenment, to the so-called uncivilized world. They didn't just conquer with guns and cannons, they conquered with ideas, languages, and religion. They used their culture as a weapon, as a tool of control. In the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, Christianity spread rapidly, sometimes by force, sometimes by persuasion. Missionaries, often well-intentioned but blinded by their own beliefs, set up churches, schools, and orphanages. They taught that European ways were the only ways, often erasing traditional beliefs and practices in the process. European languages like Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French, they became the languages of power, of government, of education. They replaced local dialects and became dominant. In many countries today, these colonial languages are still official languages, a constant reminder of the past. Now, I'm not saying that all cultural exchange is bad. Blending can be beautiful. It can create something new and vibrant. But in the context of colonization, it wasn't an equal exchange. In many cases, indigenous cultures were marginalized, their art dismissed as primitive, their customs banned as pagan, their histories rewritten by the victors. Imagine your ancestors, their stories, their wisdom, deemed worthless, irrelevant. That's what colonization did. It robbed people of their cultural identity, their sense of self. In some regions, entire generations grew up believing that civilization came only from Europe, leaving a legacy of cultural disconnection and lost identity. The wounds of cultural colonization are often invisible, but they run deep. And as if the political, economic, and cultural impacts weren't enough, colonization also changed the geography of the world, literally. Europeans, driven by their ambition and their need for resources, transformed landscapes to suit their needs. They built plantations, vast fields of monoculture, replacing diverse ecosystems with endless rows of cash crops. They dug mines, scarring the earth, extracting its riches with little regard for the environment. They laid down railroads, cutting through forests and mountains, connecting their colonies to ports where ships waited to carry away the spoils. Forests were cleared, ancient trees felled to make way for farms and settlements. Rivers were rerouted, their natural courses altered to serve irrigation canals and industrial needs. Large-scale farming, often using European methods unsuited to the local environment, replaced traditional agriculture. European colonizers, intentionally or not, introduced new crops and animals that permanently changed local ecosystems. Think about it. Wheat, cattle, and horses, now staples in the Americas. They weren't native to those lands. They arrived with the Europeans. And on the other side of the world, corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, now essential ingredients in European cuisine, they were gifts from the Americas. This exchange of plants, animals, and diseases is known as the Columbian Exchange, and its effects are still felt in global diets and environments today. But it wasn't always a benign exchange. Invasive species disrupted ecosystems, diseases decimated native populations. And then there are the borders. Colonial borders, often drawn with little understanding of ethnic or cultural divisions, have left a legacy of conflict and instability. In Africa, for example, European powers divided the continent amongst themselves at the Berlin Conference of 1884. They sat around a table, these men who had never even set foot in Africa, and carved up a continent. And who do you think wasn't invited to the table? Not a single African representative. These artificial borders, drawn with such arrogance, have contributed to conflict and division long after colonization officially ended. They ignored centuries of history, of cultural and ethnic boundaries, and created a patchwork of nations that often made little sense. The geographic impact of colonization. It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It's written on the land itself. Colonization may have begun centuries ago, but its impacts are still deeply woven into the fabric of our world. Governments shaped by foreign rule, economies built on exploitation, cultures reshaped or erased, landscapes redrawn. Understanding the full story of colonization is essential, not just to recognize the past, but to better navigate the future. Because the world we live in today was built, in part, by decisions made on ships centuries ago. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. We can acknowledge the injustices, the pain, the lasting consequences of colonization. We can listen to the stories of those whose ancestors were impacted, whose lives are still shaped by those events. Because history isn't just about what happened, It's about how it still shapes us. Every border, every language, every cultural celebration has a story, and many of those stories began when Europe sailed outward and changed the world forever.